What happens when someone who's used to controlling others through fear and intimidation meets someone who refuses to be broken? In military training camps around the world, drill instructors are known for their harsh methods, designed to break down recruits and rebuild them as soldiers. They use psychological pressure, physical demands, and sometimes crosslines that should never be crossed. But what happens when one of these powerful figures meets their match in the most unexpected person? This is the true story of Sarah Chen, a 22-year-old computer science graduate who found herself facing the most notorious drill instructor in Camp Davidson's history. Known only as Task Force to her fellow recruits, Sarah would prove that sometimes the smartest move isn't to fight back with force, but to use your mind as the ultimate weapon. Sergeant Marcus Iron Fist Rodriguez had broken hundreds of recruits over his 15-year career. He took pride in finding each person's weakness and exploiting it until they either quit or submitted completely to his authority. He had never met anyone he couldn't break. That was about to change. This is the story of how one brilliant young woman turned the tables on a system designed to crush her spirit, using nothing but her intelligence, patience, and one perfectly timed move that would expose everything. It's a story about standing up to bullies, the power of preparation, and how sometimes the person who looks weakest can be the strongest of all. Get ready to discover how Task Force outsmarted one of the military's toughest drill instructors and changed everything with a single, devastating move that no one saw coming. Sarah Chen stepped off the bus at Camp Davidson with her single duffel bag, watching as other recruits around her looked nervous and excited. The summer heat hit her face like a wall, and she could already hear shouting in the distance. This wasn't exactly how she had planned to spend her summer after graduating from Stanford with a computer science degree, but her father's military background had always made her curious about service life. The recruitment officer had painted a picture of leadership training and valuable life skills. What Sarah saw before her was different. Camp Davidson looked like something from a war movie, with its gray buildings, endless stretches of dirt, and the constant sound of boots marching in formation. She adjusted her glasses and took a deep breath. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, she knew she didn't look like typical military material. Fresh meat. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Sarah turned to see a massive man in a perfectly pressed uniform striding toward the group of new arrivals. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez was everything the stories had described and more. Standing 6 feet 3 inches tall with muscles that strained against his uniform, he had the kind of presence that made people step back without thinking. His face was weathered from years in the sun, and his eyes had the cold, calculating look of someone who enjoyed having power over others. "I am Sergeant Rodriguez, but you maggots will call me Sir or Drill Sergeant. Nothing else comes out of your pathetic mouths unless I give you permission to speak." His voice carried across the courtyard like thunder. "For the next 8 weeks, your sorry lives belong to me. I will break you down, build you up, and, if you're lucky, some of you might actually become soldiers." Sarah watched him carefully as he paced in front of the group. She had always been good at reading people, a skill that had served her well in the competitive world of technology. What she saw in Rodriguez wasn't just authority or toughness. She saw something else, something that made her stomach turn. This was a man who enjoyed causing pain. "You there, 4 eyes." Rodriguez suddenly stopped directly in front of Sarah. "What's your name, recruit?" "Sarah Chen, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the way he loomed over her. Rodriguez leaned down until his face was inches from hers. Sarah could smell his coffee breath and see the small scars on his knuckles. "You look like you've never done a hard day's work in your life, Chen. What makes you think you can make it through my program?" Sarah looked directly into his eyes, which seemed to surprise him. Most recruits looked away or down at their feet when he got this close. "I'm here to learn, sir. I'll do whatever it takes." Something flickered across Rodriguez's face. It might have been respect, but it was quickly replaced by something darker. "We'll see about that, college girl. Drop and give me 20 push-ups. Right now." Sarah immediately dropped to the ground and began doing push-ups. Her form wasn't perfect, and her arms shook after the 10th one, but she kept going. Rodriguez watched her struggle, and Sarah could hear him chuckling to himself. When she finished, she stood back up, her face red and her breathing heavy. "Pathetic," Rodriguez said loud enough for everyone to hear. "But, at least you tried. That's more than I can say for some people." His eyes swept over the group, looking for his next target. As the days went by, Sarah began to understand the rhythm of camp life. Wake up at 5 in the morning, physical training until 7, breakfast, then various military exercises throughout the day. The food was bland, the bunks were uncomfortable, and there was never enough sleep. But Sarah adapted quickly, using her analytical mind to break down each challenge and find the most efficient way to complete it. Rodriguez, however, seemed to have marked her as special target. While he was tough on everyone, he paid particular attention to Sarah. During morning runs, he would make her carry extra weight. During mealtimes, he would make her clean tables while others rested. During training exercises, he would assign her the most difficult tasks. "Shen," he would shout across the training yard. "You think because you went to some fancy college, you're smarter than everyone else? Drop and give me 50. Sarah never complained. She did every extra exercise, completed every additional task, and never gave Rodriguez the satisfaction of seeing her break. But she was watching him too, learning his patterns, studying his behavior. She noticed that he was particularly harsh on recruits who showed fear or weakness. She also noticed that he had a tendency to single out anyone who might challenge his authority. The other recruits began to take notice of how Rodriguez treated Sarah. Some felt sorry for her, while others were grateful that his attention was focused elsewhere. A few, however, started to look up to her quiet determination. Among them was Marcus Williams, a 19-year-old from Detroit who had joined the military to escape poverty, and Jenny Rodriguez, no relation to the sergeant, a tough farm girl from Iowa who could outrun most of the male recruits. "Why don't you just quit?" Marcus asked Sarah one evening as they sat in the mess hall. "He's obviously got it out for you. Nobody would blame you for leaving." Sarah looked at Marcus and, then, at Jenny, who was listening intently. "Because that's exactly what he wants," she said quietly. "He thinks he can break me because I don't look like I belong here. But I do belong here, and I'm not going anywhere." Jenny nodded approvingly. "Good for you. Rodriguez thinks he's some kind of god around here, but he's just a bully with a uniform." "Be careful saying things like that," Marcus warned, looking around nervously. "If he hears you talking about him that way, he'll make your life hell." "He already makes everyone's life hell," Jenny replied. "The difference is some people fight back and some people just take it." Sarah didn't say anything, but she was thinking. Rodriguez was indeed a bully, but he was also smart and experienced. He knew exactly how far he could push people without crossing any official lines. He was careful never to do anything that could get him in serious trouble, while still making life miserable for anyone who caught his attention. That night, as Sarah lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sounds of her fellow recruits sleeping, she began to form a plan. She couldn't fight Rodriguez with physical strength, and she couldn't simply endure his harassment forever. But she had other skills that Rodriguez didn't know about and wouldn't expect from someone like her. Sarah had always been fascinated by systems, by understanding how things worked and finding the weak points that could bring them down. At Stanford, she had been part of a cybersecurity club that specialized in finding vulnerabilities in computer networks. She had learned that the most secure-looking systems often had the biggest weaknesses, and that the people who seemed most powerful were often the most paranoid about protecting their secrets. Rodriguez was a system, just like any other. He had routines, patterns, and vulnerabilities. And Sarah was beginning to understand exactly what those vulnerabilities might be. The next morning brought another brutal physical training session. Rodriguez seemed to be in an especially bad mood, making everyone run extra laps and do additional exercises. When it came time for the obstacle course, he assigned Sarah to the most challenging route, the one usually reserved for the strongest and most experienced recruits. "Let's see what you're really made of, college girl," Rodriguez said with a cold smile. "This course has broken bigger and stronger people than you. If you can't complete it in under 10 minutes, you'll be doing it again after dinner, in the dark." Sarah looked at the obstacle course, taking in every detail. There were rope climbs, wall scaling, crawling sections, and balance challenges. It was designed to test every aspect of physical fitness and mental toughness. She had watched other recruits attempt it over the past few days, and she had seen many of them fail. But Sarah had also been studying the course, just like everything else at Camp Davidson. She had noticed patterns in how the successful recruits approached each obstacle, and she had identified several techniques that could save time and energy. Most importantly, she had realized that the course was as much about strategy as it was about strength. "I understand, sir," Sarah replied, stepping up to the starting line. Rodriguez blew his whistle, and Sarah began running. Instead of attacking each obstacle with brute force like most recruits did, she moved with calculated precision. At the rope climb, she used her legs to support her weight instead of relying entirely on her arms. At the wall, she found the handholds that provided the best leverage. During the crawling section, she stayed low and moved efficiently instead of rushing. As Sarah progressed through the course, she could hear Rodriguez shouting at her, trying to distract her and throw off her concentration. "You're too slow, Chen. My grandmother could move faster than that. You're embarrassing yourself." But Sarah blocked out his voice and focused on her technique. She knew she couldn't match the raw physical power of the male recruits, but she could be smarter about how she used her energy. When she reached the final obstacle, a series of balance beams that had to be crossed without falling, she was tired but still focused. The balance beams were where most recruits failed. They required not just physical coordination but mental calm, and Rodriguez's constant shouting usually made people nervous and more likely to fall. Sarah had watched enough attempts to know that the key was to ignore everything except the beam in front of her feet. She stepped onto the first beam and began moving across it with steady, careful steps. Rodriguez increased his shouting, but Sarah might as well have been deaf. She crossed the first beam, then the second, then the third. When she stepped off the final beam and crossed the finish line, she looked up at the timer. 9 minutes and 43 seconds. The training yard fell silent. Even Rodriguez seemed surprised. Sarah had not only completed the course within the time limit, she had done it faster than some recruits who were twice her size. More importantly, she had done it while maintaining her composure under extreme pressure. "Lucky run," Rodriguez said finally, but Sarah could hear something different in his voice. For the first time since she had arrived at Camp Davidson, she had genuinely impressed him, and he didn't like it. As Sarah walked back to join the other recruits, she could see the mixture of admiration and surprise in their faces. Marcus gave her a small nod of approval, while Jenny smiled broadly. But Sarah wasn't thinking about their approval. She was thinking about the look she had seen in Rodriguez's eyes when she crossed the finish line. It was the look of someone who had just realized that he might have underestimated his opponent. And that realization was exactly what Sarah had been working toward. The first phase of her plan was complete. Rodriguez now saw her as a potential threat to his authority, which meant he would start making mistakes. And when he made those mistakes, Sarah would be ready. Rodriguez's attitude towards Sarah changed dramatically after her performance on the obstacle course. Where before he had seemed to view her as just another weak recruit to break down, now there was something more personal in his attention. Sarah could feel his eyes on her during every training session, watching for any sign of weakness or failure that he could exploit. The change became obvious during the following week's training exercises. Rodriguez began assigning Sarah tasks that were clearly beyond what was expected of other recruits. While everyone else practiced basic rifle handling, Sarah was required to disassemble and reassemble weapons blindfolded. While others did standard physical training, Sarah had to complete additional exercises with weighted packs. During classroom sessions on military history and strategy, Rodriguez would single her out with complex questions designed to make her look foolish in front of the group. "Shun!" Rodriguez barked during one particularly intense morning session. "Since you seem to think you're so smart, tell me the strategic significance of the Battle of Gettysburg and how it relates to modern military tactics." Sarah had studied history in college, but military strategy wasn't exactly her specialty. However, she had been reading military books in her spare time since arriving at camp, partly out of genuine interest and partly because she knew Rodriguez might try to catch her unprepared. The Battle of Gettysburg demonstrated the importance of high ground and supply lines in warfare, sir. Lee's army was operating far from its supply base, while the Union forces had the advantage of defensive positions and shorter communication lines. In modern warfare, these principles translate to the importance of air superiority and satellite communications for maintaining battlefield awareness and supply chain security. Rodriguez's jaw tightened slightly. Her answer had been not just correct but demonstrated a deeper understanding than he had expected. Adequate, he said curtly, but Sarah could see that he was annoyed. Williams. What's the maximum effective range of an M16 rifle? Marcus, caught off guard by the sudden shift in attention, stammered out an approximately correct answer. Rodriguez nodded and moved on, but Sarah noticed that he had avoided asking her any more questions for the rest of the session. This pattern continued for days. Rodriguez would try to catch Sarah unprepared, she would demonstrate competence beyond what he expected, and he would become increasingly frustrated. Sarah realized that she was winning a psychological battle that Rodriguez didn't even realize he was fighting. Every time he tried to humiliate her and failed, he was actually undermining his own authority in front of the other recruits. The breaking point came during a field exercise in the third week of training. The recruits had been divided into small teams and given a navigation challenge. Each team was provided with a map, compass, and coordinates for several checkpoints that they had to reach within a specified time limit. The exercise was designed to test teamwork, leadership, and basic military skills. Sarah found herself teamed with Marcus, Jenny, and two other recruits named David Park and Amanda Foster. Rodriguez had personally assigned the teams, and Sarah suspected that he had deliberately put her with some of the stronger recruits to see if she could keep up. "All right, listen up," Rodriguez announced to all the teams. "This is a timed exercise. Each checkpoint has a code that you need to collect. The team that reaches all checkpoints fastest and returns with all the correct codes gets the rest of the day off. The team that comes in last gets to spend the evening cleaning the entire mess hall with toothbrushes." As the teams dispersed into the woods surrounding Camp Davidson, Sarah quickly took charge of navigation. She had always been good with maps and spatial reasoning, skills that had served her well in various computer programming projects. While other teams were struggling to orient themselves, Sarah had quickly identified their starting position and plotted the most efficient route to all the checkpoints. "We should go to checkpoint 3 first," she told her team, pointing to her map. "It's the farthest from here, but if we hit it first, we can work our way back and save time overall. Most teams will probably start with checkpoint 1 because it's closest, which means they'll have to backtrack later." Jenny looked at the map and nodded approvingly. "That makes sense. Marcus, what do you think?" Marcus was still getting used to the idea of taking direction from Sarah, but he had seen her analytical skills in action enough times to trust her judgment. "Let's do it. Sarah knows what she's talking about." As they moved through the forest, Sarah's route planning proved to be exactly right. They reached checkpoint 3 while other teams were still working their way to checkpoint 2. More importantly, Sarah had noticed something that the other teams had missed. The checkpoints weren't just randomly placed, they formed a pattern that corresponded to specific military formations described in their training manual. "Look at this," Sarah said, spreading the map on a fallen log when they stopped to rest. "The checkpoints aren't random. If you connect them in the right order, they form a classic flanking maneuver. That means we can predict where the final checkpoint will be even though it's not marked on our map." David looked skeptical. "How can you be sure? What if you're wrong and we end up in the wrong place?" Sarah pointed to several features on the map. "See how each marked checkpoint corresponds to key terrain features that would be important in a real military operation? High ground, water sources, natural cover. If this exercise is designed to teach us about real military tactics, then the final checkpoint has to be at the location that would complete the flanking maneuver. It's the only position that makes tactical sense." Amanda, who had been quiet up to this point, studied the map carefully. "I think she's right. This whole exercise is supposed to be educational, not just a test of our ability to follow directions." "Sarah, where do you think the final checkpoint is? Sarah pointed to a hill overlooking a small valley. There. It's the only position that would give you oversight of the entire area while providing cover and an escape route. If I were planning a real military operation, that's where I'd want my command post. The team decided to trust Sarah's analysis. When they reached the location she had predicted, they found not just the final checkpoint, but Rodriguez himself, standing next to a radio and watching the forest below through binoculars. He had been tracking all the team's progress and was clearly surprised to see Sarah's group arrive first. Well, Rodriguez said, lowering his binoculars. It looks like someone figured out the puzzle. I'm impressed, recruits. Most groups take twice as long to find this location, and some never figure out the pattern at all. Sarah stepped forward. Thank you, sir. The checkpoint pattern corresponds to the flanking maneuver described in Chapter 7 of the Field Manual. Once we identified the pattern, predicting the final location was straightforward. Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment. Sarah could see him processing not just what she had said, but the implications of it. She hadn't just completed the exercise, she had understood its underlying purpose and demonstrated strategic thinking that went beyond what was expected from recruits at their level. That's correct, Rodriguez said slowly. Congratulations, team. You've earned yourselves a free afternoon. Head back to base and enjoy your time off. As Sarah's team headed back through the forest, chatting excitedly about their success, Sarah noticed that Rodriguez had called for her to hang back. When the others were out of earshot, he approached her with an expression that was difficult to read. Chen, he said, his voice lower than usual. You've been impressing me lately. Maybe I misjudged you when you first arrived. Sarah remained at attention, unsure where this conversation was heading. Thank you, sir. Rodriguez stepped closer, and Sarah noticed that he seemed different when they were alone. The harsh, commanding presence he maintained in front of groups was replaced by something more personal and, somehow more threatening. You know, I've been in this job for 15 years. I've trained hundreds of recruits, and I can usually tell within the first week who's going to make it and who's going to wash out. But, you're different. I'm just doing my best, sir, Sarah replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite feeling increasingly uncomfortable with Rodriguez's proximity. Yes, you are, Rodriguez said, reaching out to adjust her uniform collar in a way that seemed unnecessary and inappropriate. I like that about you. You've got potential, Chen. Real potential. And I think you and I could work well together, if you know what I mean. The implication in his voice was unmistakable. Sarah felt her stomach turn as she realized what Rodriguez was suggesting. This wasn't about her performance or her potential as a soldier. This was about something else entirely, and it was completely inappropriate. I'm not sure I understand what you mean, sir, Sarah said carefully, stepping back slightly. Rodriguez's expression hardened. I think you understand perfectly, recruit. See, here's the thing about military life. It's all about relationships, about who you know and who looks out for you. I could make your time here very easy, Chen. Or I could make it very difficult. The choice is yours. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She finally understood what was really happening here. Rodriguez's increased attention, his personal interest in her performance, the way he looked at her when he thought no one else was watching. This wasn't about military training at all. I appreciate your guidance, sir, Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. I'd like to rejoin my team now. Rodriguez studied her face for a moment, then stepped back with a cold smile. Of course, recruit. Run along. But think about what I said. Really think about it. Because this offer won't be available forever. As Sarah walked back through the forest to catch up with her team, her mind was racing. She had suspected that Rodriguez was a bully and an abuser of power, but this was something much worse. He was using his position of authority to sexually harass female recruits, and he was doing it in a way that would be almost impossible to prove or report. Sarah realized that she wasn't just dealing with a tough drill instructor anymore. She was dealing with a predator who used the military's strict hierarchy and culture of obedience to exploit vulnerable people. And, now that she had caught his attention, she was directly in his crosshairs. But Sarah also realized something else. Rodriguez had just made his first major mistake. By approaching her alone and making his intentions clear, he had revealed his true nature. And, more importantly, he had underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. Sarah had grown up in the technology world, where sexual harassment and abuse of power were unfortunately common problems. She had learned early in her career to document everything, to build cases carefully, and to be prepared for situations exactly like this. Rodriguez might have 15 years of experience breaking down recruits, but Sarah had skills that he couldn't even imagine. As she rejoined her team, who were celebrating their successful completion of the exercise, Sarah began planning her next move. She had wanted to understand Rodriguez's weaknesses and wait for him to make a mistake. Now she knew exactly what his weakness was, and he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The war between them was about to escalate to a completely different level, and Rodriguez had no idea what was coming. The next few days at Camp Davidson were tense for Sarah, though she was careful not to let it show. Rodriguez continued his normal routine of harsh training and intimidation with all the recruits, but Sarah could feel the undercurrent of his threat hanging over her. He would catch her eye during training sessions and give her meaningful looks that made her skin crawl. During mealtimes, he would find reasons to speak to her privately, always with seemingly innocent questions about her progress, but with an undertone that reminded her of their conversation in the forest. Sarah knew she needed to be extremely careful about how she handled the situation. Military culture placed enormous emphasis on hierarchy and following orders, and Rodriguez was skilled at maintaining a facade of professionalism when others were around. If she made accusations without solid evidence, it would be her word against his, and he had 15 years of reputation and relationships to protect him. Instead, Sarah began to systematically gather information. She started paying closer attention to Rodriguez's interactions with all the recruits, particularly the female ones. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Rodriguez had clearly been using his position to harass and intimidate female recruits for years, but he was clever about it. During an evening maintenance session where recruits were required to clean equipment and facilities, Sarah noticed Rodriguez approach Amanda Foster while she was working alone in the supply room. Sarah positioned herself where she could hear their conversation without being seen. "Foster," Rodriguez said, his voice taking on the same tone Sarah had heard in the forest. "You've been struggling with the physical training lately. I'd hate to see you fail out of the program because you couldn't keep up." "I'm doing my best, sir," Amanda replied nervously. "I know I'm not as fast as some of the others, but I'm getting stronger every day." "That's good to hear," Rodriguez said, and Sarah could hear him moving closer to Amanda. "Tell you what, why don't you come by my office after dinner tonight? I can give you some personal training tips that might help you improve your performance. One-on-one coaching can be very effective." There was a long pause before Amanda responded. "Thank you, sir, but I think I'll be fine with the regular training schedule." Rodriguez's voice hardened slightly. "I see. Well, that's your choice, Foster. But don't come crying to me when you can't pass your fitness tests. Some people need extra help to succeed, and some people are too proud to accept it." Sarah heard footsteps as Rodriguez left the supply room. A moment later, Amanda emerged looking shaken and upset. Sarah pretended to be focused on cleaning her rifle, but she made a mental note of everything she had heard. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk thinking about what she had witnessed. Rodriguez was clearly using the same tactics on multiple women. He would identify recruits who were struggling or insecure, offer private help that was actually harassment, and then make it clear that refusing his advances would result in negative consequences for their military careers. Sarah realized that she needed to find other victims and document Rodriguez's pattern of behavior. But she also knew that approaching other recruits directly could be dangerous. If Rodriguez found out that she was investigating him, he could make her life at camp unbearable or even find ways to force her out of the program. The next morning brought another challenging training session. Rodriguez announced that they would be practicing combat scenarios, with recruits paired up to practice hand-to-hand combat techniques. Sarah found herself paired with David Park, one of the larger male recruits who had been on her navigation team. As they went through the practice exercises, Sarah noticed Rodriguez paying particular attention to how she performed against her male partner. When David successfully pinned her during a grappling exercise, Rodriguez called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Good work, Park. Chen, you need to be more aggressive. In real combat, the enemy won't go easy on you just because you're a woman. You need to use every advantage you have." Rodriguez then demonstrated a series of moves on Sarah herself, ostensibly to show her proper technique. But, as he positioned her body and adjusted her stance, his hands lingered longer than necessary and moved to areas that had nothing to do with the combat techniques he was supposedly teaching. "Feel the difference in leverage when you position your hips like this," Rodriguez said, placing his hands on Sarah's waist in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. "You have to use your whole body, not just your arms." Sarah endured the demonstration, knowing that any objection would be dismissed as her not being able to handle normal military training. But she was also documenting every inappropriate touch, every unnecessarily close position, and every comment that crossed the line from professional instruction to sexual harassment. After the training session, Sarah made an excuse to stay behind and organize equipment while the other recruits headed to lunch. She wanted to observe Rodriguez when he thought he was unobserved. What she saw confirmed her worst suspicions. Rodriguez spent several minutes looking through personnel files that were kept in a locked cabinet in the training facility. Sarah positioned herself where she could see which files he was examining. He was specifically looking at the records of female recruits, paying particular attention to their personal information, emergency contacts, and performance evaluations. Sarah realized that Rodriguez was using official military records to gather information about female recruits that he could use to manipulate them. If someone was struggling financially, he would know about it. If someone had family problems, he would know about it. If someone was particularly isolated or vulnerable, he would know about it. This was systematic predatory behavior, and Sarah knew that she wasn't the first person to figure it out. But she was probably the first person with the technical skills and knowledge to do something about it. That evening, during the brief period when recruits were allowed to write letters home, Sarah began documenting everything she had observed. But, instead of writing a letter, she was creating a detailed timeline of Rodriguez's behavior, including dates, times, witnesses, and specific actions. She was building a case the same way she would document a security vulnerability in a computer system. Sarah also began reaching out carefully to other female recruits. She started with Jenny, who she knew was tough enough to handle the conversation and unlikely to be intimidated by Rodriguez. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said during a quiet moment when they were both on kitchen duty. "Has Rodriguez ever made you uncomfortable? Like, beyond just being a tough instructor?" Jenny looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then nodded grimly. "Yeah, he has. Nothing I could really report, you know? But he's definitely crossed some lines." "Why do you ask?" "He's done the same thing to me," Sarah admitted. "And I think he's doing it to others too. I'm trying to figure out if there's a pattern." Jenny's expression darkened. "There's definitely a pattern. I've heard whispers from some of the other girls, but everyone's too scared to say anything official. Rodriguez has too much power here, and the military doesn't exactly have a great track record of believing women when they make these kinds of accusations." Sarah nodded. "That's what I figured. But what if we could prove it? What if we could document everything so thoroughly that they couldn't ignore it? How would we do that?" Jenny asked skeptically. "It's not like he's stupid enough to do anything obvious when there are witnesses around." Sarah had been thinking about this problem for days, and she had an idea that would use skills Rodriguez couldn't possibly anticipate. "I might have a way," she said carefully. "But I'd need your help, and it would be risky." Jenny looked at Sarah with new respect. "You're planning something, aren't you? Something big." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But first I need to be absolutely sure about what we're dealing with. And I need to find out if there are other victims who would be willing to come forward." Over the next several days, Sarah and Jenny carefully approached other female recruits. They were discreet about it, bringing up the subject only when they could speak privately and only with women they trusted. What they discovered was even worse than Sarah had expected. Rodriguez had been sexually harassing female recruits for years. Some had endured it and kept quiet, hoping to just get through the program. Others had been driven to quit the military entirely. A few had tried to report it through official channels, but their complaints had been dismissed or buried by Rodriguez's superiors, who valued his reputation as an effective trainer more than they cared about the experiences of female recruits. Amanda Foster finally opened up about her encounter with Rodriguez, revealing that it hadn't been the first time he had approached her inappropriately. Two other female recruits, Lisa Martinez and Kelly Thompson, admitted that Rodriguez had made similar advances toward them, using the same tactics of offering private training sessions that were actually opportunities for harassment. Sarah realized that she was uncovering a systematic pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. Rodriguez wasn't just a tough instructor who occasionally crossed a line, he was a serial predator who used his position of power to systematically target vulnerable women. But Sarah also realized that she now had something Rodriguez didn't know about, a network of women who were willing to work together to expose him. And, more importantly, she had the technical skills to gather evidence in ways that Rodriguez would never see coming. The plan that Sarah had been developing in her mind was ambitious and risky, but it was also the kind of systematic approach that Rodriguez's previous victims had never been able to implement. Sarah wasn't just going to report Rodriguez's behavior, she was going to trap him with his own actions and create evidence that would be impossible to deny or dismiss. But, first, she needed to set the perfect trap. And that meant making Rodriguez believe that he had finally found his next victim. Sarah's plan required perfect timing and careful preparation. She knew that Rodriguez was expecting her to either submit to his advances or resist in a way that would allow him to retaliate professionally. What he wasn't expecting was for her to turn his own methods against him using technology he didn't understand. The key to Sarah's plan was her background in cybersecurity. At Stanford, she had learned not just how to build secure systems, but how to find weaknesses in existing ones. She had also learned that the most effective security breaches often came from exploiting human behavior rather than just technical vulnerabilities. Rodriguez was a human system with predictable patterns and exploitable weaknesses. Sarah had identified those weaknesses, now she needed to exploit them. The first phase of her plan involved appearing to be more vulnerable than she actually was. During the following week's training sessions, Sarah began subtly changing her behavior. She started seeming more tired and stressed, letting her normally perfect performance slip just slightly. She made small mistakes during drills that she normally would have executed flawlessly. She even allowed herself to appear emotional after a particularly harsh criticism from Rodriguez. "Shun," Rodriguez barked during one morning training session. "Your form is sloppy today. Drop and give me 30 push-ups." Instead of immediately complying as she normally would, Sarah hesitated for just a moment, allowing a flash of what appeared to be frustration to cross her face before dropping to the ground. As she did the push-ups, she let her arms shake more than they needed to, making herself appear weaker than she actually was. Rodriguez noticed the change immediately. Sarah could see him watching her more intently, like a predator sensing that his prey was finally beginning to weaken. This was exactly what she wanted. The second phase of her plan involved technology that Rodriguez couldn't see. Sarah had managed to get access to a smartphone during one of their rare trips to the base exchange. Officially, recruits weren't supposed to have personal electronics during training, but Sarah had acquired an older model phone and hidden it carefully among her personal belongings. The phone served two purposes. First, it allowed Sarah to research Rodriguez's background using the base's limited internet access. What she found was disturbing but useful. Rodriguez had been transferred between different training facilities several times over his career, always with excellent performance reviews but also with a pattern of complaints from female recruits that had been quietly dismissed. More importantly, the phone had recording capabilities that Sarah could use to document Rodriguez's behavior. But she needed to be extremely careful about when and how she used it, because getting caught with unauthorized electronics would result in immediate dismissal from the program. The third phase of her plan involved setting up the perfect scenario for Rodriguez to reveal his true nature. Sarah knew that Rodriguez preferred to approach his victims when they were isolated and vulnerable. She also knew that he was most likely to cross clear lines when he believed he had complete control of the situation. Sarah began staying after training sessions to practice skills that she was supposedly struggling with. She made sure Rodriguez knew she was staying late, and she positioned herself in locations where he would feel comfortable approaching her privately. After several days of this behavior, Rodriguez took the bait.
"Chen," he said one evening as Sarah was practicing rifle maintenance in the equipment room. "You've seemed distracted lately. Is everything all right?"
Sarah looked up from her weapon, allowing herself to appear tired and frustrated.
"I'm fine, sir.
Just trying to make sure I don't fall behind." Rodriguez entered the equipment room and closed the door behind him, which was a clear violation of protocol when a male instructor was meeting with a female recruit. "You know, I've noticed you've been pushing yourself pretty hard lately."
"Maybe too hard."
"I just want to do well, sir," Sarah replied, positioning herself so that the phone hidden in her equipment bag would have a clear line of sight to where Rodriguez was standing. Rodriguez moved closer, adopting the same predatory stance Sarah had seen him use with other female recruits.
"I appreciate that about you, Chun. You've got dedication. But sometimes dedication isn't enough. Sometimes you need someone looking out for you, someone who can help you succeed." Sarah activated the phone's recording function with a gesture that appeared to be adjusting her equipment.
"I'm grateful for any guidance you can provide, sir." "I'm sure you are," Rodriguez said, his voice dropping to a lower, more intimate tone. "You know, I've been in this position for a long time. I've seen a lot of recruits come through here, and I can usually tell who's going to make it and who isn't."
"You want to know what I think about you?"
"Yes, sir," Sarah said, though every instinct was screaming at her to leave the room immediately. Rodriguez stepped even closer, now clearly invading her personal space.
"I think you're special, Chen. I think you have potential that most people don't see.
But I also think you need someone to guide you, someone who understands how things really work around here." He reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was clearly inappropriate.
"The thing about military life is that it's all about relationships. Who you know, who looks out for you, who you're willing to work with."
"I could make sure your time here goes very smoothly, if you know what I mean." Sarah forced herself to remain calm even though her heart was racing.
"I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting, sir."
Rodriguez's hand moved from her shoulder to her back, and his voice became even more explicit.
"I think you understand perfectly. You're a smart girl, Chen. Too smart to pretend you don't know what I'm offering you.
I can make sure you pass all your evaluations, get good assignments, maybe even fast-track your promotions.
All I'm asking for in return is a little cooperation."
His hand moved lower on her back, making his intentions unmistakably clear.
"We could start tonight, after everyone else is asleep. My office is private, and no one would ever know. What do you say, Chen? Are you smart enough to take advantage of this opportunity?" Sarah had exactly what she needed.
Rodriguez had just explicitly propositioned her for sex in exchange for favorable treatment, while physically touching her inappropriately.
Everything was being recorded in high-quality audio and video.
But she also knew that she needed to get out of this situation safely. "That's a very generous offer, sir," Sarah said carefully.
"Can I have some time to think about it?" Rodriguez's expression darkened slightly. "This isn't really a thinking kind of situation, Chen.
This is more of a yes or no situation. And I should mention that saying no might not be very good for your future here." The threat was now explicit and recorded. Rodriguez was using his position of authority to coerce sexual favors from a subordinate, which was both a crime and a serious violation of military regulations. Sarah had more than enough evidence to destroy his career, but she needed to extract herself from the immediate situation without arousing his suspicion.
"I understand, sir," Sarah said. "You're right that this is an important decision. Can we discuss this more tomorrow?" I want to make sure I give you the answer you deserve.
Rodriguez studied her face for a moment, clearly trying to determine whether she was genuinely considering his proposition or buying time to figure out how to refuse him. Sarah kept her expression neutral and submissive, playing the role of an intimidated recruit who was overwhelmed by his offer.
Tomorrow evening, Rodriguez said finally. After dinner, come to my office.
We'll discuss your future here, and you can show me how much you appreciate my guidance.
Yes, sir, Sarah replied, though she had no intention of keeping that appointment.
Rodriguez gave her shoulder one final squeeze that lingered far too long, then left the equipment room.
As soon as he was gone, Sarah stopped the recording and carefully secured the phone in her equipment bag.
Her hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline, but she felt a surge of satisfaction. She had just recorded Rodriguez committing multiple serious offenses, and she had done it in a way that would be impossible for him to deny or explain away.
But Sarah knew that having evidence was only the first step. She still needed to figure out how to use that evidence most effectively, and she needed to do it in a way that would protect her and the other women Rodriguez had victimized. Over the next 24 hours, Sarah finalized her plan.
She had recorded Rodriguez's misconduct, documented his pattern of behavior with other female recruits, and identified the chain of command she would need to bypass to ensure that her complaint was taken seriously. But Sarah also realized that she could do something that Rodriguez's previous victims had never been able to do.
She could ensure that her evidence couldn't be suppressed, dismissed, or buried by Rodriguez's supporters.
And she could do it using the same technological skills that had gotten her into Stanford and made her successful in the competitive world of computer science.
Rodriguez thought he was dealing with just another vulnerable young woman who could be intimidated into silence.
He had no idea that he had just walked into a trap set by someone with the skills and knowledge to expose him completely. The final phase of Sarah's plan was about to begin, and Rodriguez was going to learn exactly who he had been underestimating.
The morning of Sarah's planned reckoning began like any other at Camp Davidson.
Rodriguez conducted his usual harsh training sessions, barked orders at recruits, and maintained his facade of being a tough but professional instructor. He had no idea that his career was about to end in spectacular fashion.
Sarah had spent the previous night finalizing her preparations.
She had compiled all her evidence into a comprehensive digital package that included the audio and video recording of Rodriguez's explicit proposition, written statements from other female recruits who had been harassed, documented patterns of his behavior, and research showing his history of similar complaints at previous assignments. But Sarah's plan went far beyond simply filing a complaint through normal military channels. She had learned enough about military bureaucracy to know that complaints against popular drill instructors were often suppressed or ignored, especially when they came from junior recruits with no political power. Rodriguez had survived previous accusations because he had allies in the command structure who valued his reputation more than they cared about his victims. Sarah was going to make sure that this time, there would be no opportunity for cover-up or suppression. The first phase of her final plan involved ensuring that her evidence would be seen by people outside the immediate chain of command at Camp Davidson. Using the internet access available during their limited free time, Sarah had researched military regulations and identified the proper channels for reporting serious misconduct. She had also identified several military justice advocacy organizations that specialized in helping service members report abuse and misconduct. Sarah uploaded copies of her evidence to secure cloud storage accounts and prepared detailed reports that she could send to multiple recipients simultaneously. She also prepared a civilian backup plan, identifying journalists and advocacy groups that specialized in military misconduct cases, in case the military chose to ignore or suppress her complaints. But the most ingenious part of Sarah's plan involved using Rodriguez's own methods against him. Sarah knew that Rodriguez felt most confident when he believed he had complete control over a situation. She was going to give him exactly that false sense of security, right up until the moment when his world collapsed around him.
That evening, as Rodriguez had instructed, Sarah appeared at his office after dinner.
She had informed Jenny and several other recruits about where she was going, ostensibly so they could cover for her if anyone asked where she was. In reality, Sarah wanted witnesses who could testify that she had gone to Rodriguez's office as requested.
Rodriguez's office was located in the administrative building, separate from the barracks where the recruits slept. It was a private space where he could meet with recruits without being observed by other staff members. Sarah realized that he had probably used this office to harass female recruits for years. When Sarah knocked on his door, Rodriguez opened it with a satisfied smile. He was wearing his dress uniform instead of his normal training clothes, and Sarah could smell alcohol on his breath. It was clear that he had been preparing for what he thought would be a successful seduction. "Right on time, Chen," Rodriguez said, stepping aside to let her enter the office. "I like that about you. Punctuality is an important military virtue." Sarah entered the office and immediately began taking note of her surroundings. Rodriguez's desk was clear except for a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. The blinds were drawn, and he had locked the door behind her. Everything about the setup confirmed that he had done this before and had developed a routine for it. "Please, sit down," Rodriguez said, gesturing to a chair position directly across from his desk. "Can I offer you a drink? I think we have some celebrating to do." "Thank you, sir, but I don't drink," Sarah replied, remaining standing. Rodriguez poured himself a generous glass of whiskey and leaned against his desk in a casual pose that was clearly intended to appear relaxed and non-threatening. "That's fine, more for me. So, Chen, have you thought about our conversation yesterday?" Sarah looked directly into his eyes. "Yes, sir, I have." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Rodriguez asked, taking a sip of his whiskey. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital device that Rodriguez didn't immediately recognize. "I concluded that you're a sexual predator who has been abusing your position of authority to harass and assault female recruits for years." Rodriguez's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. "Excuse me? I have audio and video recordings of you explicitly propositioning me for sex in exchange for favorable treatment," Sarah continued, her voice completely steady and professional. "I have written statements from multiple other female recruits documenting similar harassment. And I have evidence showing that you've been transferred between facilities specifically because of previous complaints about your conduct." Rodriguez set down his glass and stood up straight, his facade of casual friendliness disappearing completely. "You're making some very serious accusations, recruit. Accusations that could destroy your military career before it even begins." "You're right," Sarah agreed. "These are serious accusations. Which is why I've documented everything thoroughly and prepared multiple copies of all evidence." She held up the digital device, which Rodriguez now realized was a smartphone. "This contains everything. And, in approximately 10 minutes, copies of all this evidence will be automatically sent to the Inspector General's office, the Military Criminal Investigation Command, the Pentagon's Sexual Assault Prevention Office, and 3 different civilian advocacy organizations that specialize in military misconduct cases." Rodriguez's face had gone pale. "You can't prove any of this." "It's your word against mine, and I've been here for 15 years. Sarah smiled for the first time since entering his office. "Actually, Sergeant Rodriguez, I can prove all of it. You see, I've been recording this entire conversation as well." She held up the phone so he could see the screen, which clearly showed an active recording in progress. "You've just been caught on camera admitting that you're in a position of authority over me, in your private office, after propositing me for sex. This recording, combined with yesterday's recording, provides clear evidence of sexual harassment and abuse of power." Rodriguez lunged toward Sarah, clearly intending to grab the phone, but Sarah had anticipated this reaction. She stepped back quickly and held up her other hand, which contained what appeared to be a simple fitness tracker. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Sarah said calmly. "This device is monitoring my vital signs and location. If my heart rate spikes or I stop moving, it will automatically trigger the immediate release of all evidence to every recipient on my list, along with GPS coordinates showing that I'm in your office." Rodriguez stopped mid-lunge, realizing that he was completely trapped. Any aggressive action against Sarah would only provide additional evidence of his misconduct and potentially escalate his charges from harassment to assault. "You see, Sergeant," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the same cold, professional tone that Rodriguez used when he was intimidating recruits,
I've spent the last 4 years studying cybersecurity and digital forensics. I know how to gather evidence, how to preserve it, and how to ensure it can't be suppressed or destroyed.
You picked the wrong person to mess with.
Rodriguez staggered backward and collapsed into his chair, the full implications of his situation finally becoming clear to him.
What do you want?
He asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
I want you to understand something very important, Sarah said. All those women you've harassed and assaulted over the years? They weren't weak or stupid or unable to fight back. They were operating in a system that was designed to protect you and silence them. But that system has weaknesses, just like any other system. She moved closer to his desk, now clearly in control of the situation. You made 2 critical mistakes, Sergeant. First, you assumed that because I looked vulnerable, I actually was vulnerable. Second, you assumed that because your previous victims couldn't stop you, no one could stop you. Sarah glanced at her phone. We now have about 5 minutes before the evidence package is automatically transmitted. You have 2 choices.
You can cooperate with the investigation that's about to begin, provide full disclosure about your misconduct, and help ensure that your other victims receive justice. Or you can try to fight this and face additional charges for obstruction and witness intimidation. Rodriguez looked up at Sarah with an expression that mixed fear, anger, and something that might have been respect.
You've been planning this from the beginning, haven't you?
I've been planning this since the moment you made it clear what kind of person you really are, Sarah confirmed. The only question now is whether you're going to make this process easier or harder for everyone involved. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, Sarah could see that the fight had gone out of him completely.
What happens now? Sarah checked her phone again. In about 2 minutes, investigations will begin at multiple levels.
Military Criminal Investigation Command will open a formal case.
The Inspector General will launch an inquiry.
Civilian advocacy groups will start providing support to your victims. And you will be immediately suspended from your position pending the outcome of those investigations. She moved toward the door, then turned back to face Rodriguez one final time.
You know what the really ironic part is, Sergeant?
You thought you were teaching us about military strategy and tactics. But the most important lesson you taught me was how to identify an enemy's weaknesses and exploit them systematically.
You just never realized that you were the enemy.
Sarah opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving Rodriguez alone in his office with the wreckage of his career and the certain knowledge that his years of predatory behavior had finally caught up with him.
As she walked back toward the barracks, Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and relief.
She had accomplished something that Rodriguez's previous victims had never been able to do. She had exposed him completely, in a way that made denial or cover-up impossible. But, more importantly, she had proven something to herself and to everyone who had watched her journey at Camp Davidson.
Sometimes the person who looks weakest is actually the strongest.
Sometimes the smartest move isn't to fight force with force, but to use intelligence, preparation, and patience to achieve victory. When Sarah reached the barracks, she found Jenny and several other recruits waiting for her with expressions of concern and curiosity.
Well? Jenny asked. How did it go?
Sarah looked at her phone, which showed that the evidence package had been successfully transmitted to all recipients.
Rodriguez won't be a problem anymore, she said simply.
Within hours, military police arrived at Camp Davidson to take Rodriguez into custody. The investigation that followed would reveal a pattern of misconduct spanning his entire career, affecting dozens of female recruits across multiple installations. Rodriguez would eventually be court-martialed, sentenced to military prison, and dishonorably discharged from the service. But, perhaps more importantly, Sarah's methodical approach to gathering and presenting evidence became a model for how other victims of military sexual harassment could seek justice. Her case demonstrated that even in systems designed to protect perpetrators, determined individuals with the right skills and knowledge could still achieve accountability. Sarah completed her training at Camp Davidson under a new drill instructor and went on to have a successful military career. She specialized in cybersecurity and eventually became involved in developing better systems for reporting and investigating misconduct within the military. Years later, when people asked her about her confrontation with Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah would always emphasize the same point: victory didn't come from being stronger or tougher than her opponent. It came from being smarter, more prepared, and more patient. It came from understanding that every system has vulnerabilities, and that sometimes the most powerful people are actually the most vulnerable when their weaknesses are properly exploited. Rodriguez had spent 15 years believing that his position and authority made him untouchable. Sarah had proven him wrong with one perfectly executed plan that turned his own methods against him. In the end, the drill instructor who had tried to strike found himself completely outmaneuvered by the quiet recruit he had underestimated. It was a lesson in the true meaning of strategic thinking, and a reminder that real strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the intelligence and courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible.